All right. Well, tonight's class is about container gardening, which is it's going to be like I said, it's going to be a shorter class. So I don't have a whole lot to say, but I have some really great tips, and we're going to talk about different kinds of containers to use and techniques and stuff, and how to do it indoors and outdoors. And this is really fantastic because in the city, it can be hard to find actual land to grow out of. But with using containers, I mean, even if you have just like a parking, a parking concrete pad in your backyard, you can grow off of that, in containers. You can grow indoors. You can have balconies, rooftops. This is a great technique to just make whatever you have work. So we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the types of plants that work really well with container gardens. And we're going to talk about growing tips, the type of containers that you won't want to use, and the ones that you don't want to use. Talk about drainage and soil and maintenance, and then we're going to talk a little bit about these really cool self-watering containers that you can make, that you can go on vacation for a week and come back and not have dead plants waiting for you. All right, so let's start off with plants. So there's definitely certain plants work better than others in containers. Definitely, like, just think about like in a windy day. If you put like a really tall plant in like a small container, that thing is just going to fall over. So that's ideally what you're trying to avoid. You're basically, what we're looking for is we're looking for short and stout, and bush like, varieties as much as possible, where even if a wind hits it, it is likely not going to fall over. So ideally, like, think about like greens like kale and collards and broccoli and things that are grow are short and can handle the wind as well. Root vegetables are great as well. Herbs are wonderful. But when you're thinking about bigger things like tomatoes and cucumbers and eggplants and stuff, you want to look for the three main words. You want to either look for dwarf variety, patio, or bush variety. So those varieties are all bush-like. They're all compact. A lot of them sometimes are even bred to be container. Like, especially like patio stuff is bred to be in the container on a patio. So they work really great. Like, for example, this is a cucumber. This is a patio cucumber. It's still going to grow a little bit out of it, but it's not going to be your normal cucumber that would take up your entire balcony. Like, these are your peas. Bush variety peas work great as opposed to vine varieties. This is especially when, like, doing tomatoes. Think about, there's two different types of tomatoes. You have the indeterminate tomatoes. So those are your tomatoes like sun golds and early girl that just grow forever, and they just they'll grow 6-7 feet tall if you give them the right trellis. And that, unless you have a great trellis system, which I will talk about how you can do trellises on containers. That's great, but it's kind of hard to do trellises on containers. So it's easier just to use plants that don't need trellises, like a determinate tomatoes. So determinate tomatoes are small, compact tomato plants that often don't need trellises. Sometimes it helps just put like a single bamboo stake or something just to give it a little support, but usually they don't need trellises. And determinate are oftentimes what, like your sauce tomatoes, like they're your tomatoes that you often use for sauces, because oftentimes, like, well, one, they're great. They're really great for sauces, but also um a lot of times, like, determinate, like, they produce a lot. Like, you'll get a big harvest over like a month or two, and then that's it. Like, it'll slowly dwindle down, as opposed to a lot of your indeterminate tomatoes will produce for 4 or 5, 6 months before they start slowing down. So determinate, you'll get a lot of tomatoes really quickly. And so that's why a lot of people will can them or make sauces out of them. So those are like Roma, your husk cherries, Ruggers, tomatoes. So they're really great. Like, they're the kind of tomatoes you would want to make a sauce out of anyways if you went to the grocery store. So if you're going to do tomatoes, determinate. Unless well, I'll talk about some ways that you can do indeterminate. It's just a little bit more trickier. But definitely, like, we talked about peas and beans and cucumbers. All, you want bush varieties. If you want squash, Summer squash typically is more the bush variety, and winter squash is like your pumpkins and stuff that more vines all over the place. That being said, you could find right now there seems to be a hybrid for everything. You could find winter squash like acorn squash that is a bush variety. But typically, it's summer squash is a bush and winter squash is a vine. So if you're wanting to do squash, I would recommend summer squash, or or if you do winter squash, find a bush variety, so it's not just going to grow all over your balcony. And then you can do if you want to do like a lot of like vine stuff, like indeterminate tomatoes and sweet potatoes, you can make trellises. I mean, oftentimes you're going to have to like put the trellis on the wall or something and then back that container. And we'll talk about how to do that in a second. But another really great way is to put them in buckets and just let them hang. So this is actually a hanging sweet potato. Sweet potatoes are great hanging plants. So they just have a normal, one of those pots that has like a hook on it that you can hang, and they just let it drape over. And you can actually harvest sweet potato leaves. You can saute them; they're really delicious. You don't want to take too much because that's going to, affect your sweet potato growth. But you can, definitely take a handful every week from that, and that works really well. And then I really love these tomatoes. So I had a buddy that lived in it was like the fourth floor of an apartment complex, and he really wanted this indeterminate variety. So he did this thing where he it's a 5 gallon bucket, and you could put it on the top, or but he actually punctured the hole in the bottom and then shoved the seedling up there. Compact it really well, and then as it grew, he just hung it out of his window. So he didn't have any windows below him, or they would be pretty annoyed. But it literally like just hung out of his window and grew like 6 feet down below. And then when he wanted tomatoes, he would pull the whole thing up and then grab some tomatoes and put it all out. So it was a little bit of a process to harvest. But he grew these giant indeterminate tomatoes in 5 gallon buckets in some tiny apartment on the fourth floor. So that's another way. So you can get creative on these things. But like I said, I mean, it takes a little bit more to figure out how to do hanging things and trellising, which typically most people, they just, they just look for small bush-like varieties and put them in containers, and then you don't have to worry about how to, adapt your situation to that long viney plant. And then the last thing, if you're going to, think about, and this is more for indoors, if you're growing things indoors, you want to look for things that don't need to be pollinated by bugs that have that, we talked about that, I think in the second class. There's certain things that have male and female flowers that need like, bugs to pollinate them. And then there's other things like, tomatoes and eggplants that have both male and female parts in the same flower. So oftentimes you just need to shake them a little bit. So you can definitely think about hand pollinating. Like if you want to do a summer squash, you can hand pollinate them. So you don't, or you could just bring them out when the flowers open, bring them out outside during the day, and for some bugs, some bees and things that pollinate, and then bring them back inside. But that's if you have that situation. But if you don't have a place you can bring them outside, you definitely want to find the things that don't need to be pollinated by insects, or that you can hand pollinate, like summer squash. And then fruit trees are fantastic for containers, like certain varieties as well. But there's I kind of broke them up into two different categories. There's certain fruit trees that don't really do very well in our cold. They don't, that usually die in frost. And these are, for sure, your lemons, limes, and citrus, and figs as well. Figs are right on the borderline. They often survive in our climates, but if we get really, a harsh frost, oftentimes the tops will all die, but the roots will survive, and then they'll come back like even more of like a crazy bush, instead of a single tree. But and then sometimes though, if we have a really bad frost, and with a really bad conditions, figs will die. So that's why it's nice to put fig trees in a container. I mean, you want to, when you do these trees, you want to have a decent sized container, like at least 5 gallons. Like if you think about 5 gallons, so a 5 gallon bucket. This is a 5 gallon bucket, so that's ideally like a great size for most plants, especially fruit trees. So if you want to do that or bigger, you don't want to fruit trees in a really small container because they're not going to survive. But I really love like lemons and limes. They're great for these containers. A lot of them will only get maybe like 2 or 3 feet tall. They're nice bush like, and then they'll produce lemons and limes all summer, and then I'll bring them inside during the winter. I'll keep them in my basement and let them go dormant, which we'll talk about that in a second. Um, and then when in spring, when it warms up, I'll bring them back outside. And I got like, several lemon and lime trees that I've been growing for years, and getting lemon and limes from them. So definitely, those, are fantastic. You just have to be able to store those in during the winter because they will not survive the winter. And then you have other fruit trees that actually need the winter. They need that frost to actually touch their buds to kind of activate, a lot of things like a lot of biology I don't understand. I just know like things like apples and cherries and peaches need some kind of winter in order to get ready to start producing fruit in the next spring. But so if you look at varieties, if you go order, like I love Stark Brothers. That's where I get most of my fruits from. I think it's from they're Pennsylvania, I believe. You can order all kinds of like berries and fruit trees and things like that. And they have a lot of great discounts and deals. You can get but they have this really great map where they show the three different sizes for trees. So most peaches and apples and cherries, a standard tree. Let's say for like peaches and cherries, a standard tree could be 15 feet or taller. Apples, and cherries, they can actually get like 20 to 30 feet. But that's like if you want a giant tree and you have a ladder to harvest your fruit, you get standard trees. If you want like a big tree but not so big that you need a ladder, you could do semi dwarf. That's where it's going to be like 10 to 15 feet. But if you're doing containers, you want to look for dwarf varieties, and that's where you can keep them anywhere. This says 8 to 10 feet, but if you keep them in a 5 gallon container, I mean, you can keep them at like 5 or 6 feet. Like you can keep this like lemon and lime trees, and things, and cherries and stuff. They won't get much bigger than this in a 5 gallon container. So if you're looking for a nice size tree, make sure you get either dwarf or use one of these varieties, and then just double check that the height measurements. Um, and then uh and you can like for peaches, apples, and cherries, like you can't there if you don't have a place to bring them inside, you can actually dig a big hole and drop it the you could actually drop it into the ground, mulch it really well on the top, and that should keep that root ball, that root ball should survive. And then you can in the spring you can dig it up, pull it out, and move it to wherever you want. Or a lot of people will actually like people can do banana, I see a lot of people do banana trees in DC. And bananas, the winter is pretty harsh for bananas. I know some varieties can survive a mild winter, but what a lot of people will do with bananas is they'll grow that banana tree out. It gets like 15, 20 feet tall in your yard, a mature one. It takes a couple years before it starts fruiting, but they'll grow it out in their yard. And then in October, they'll actually dig it up and put it in a container, bring it inside, and then bring it back outside in the spring, and then just replant it. And they'll keep on doing that. And after like the third or fourth year, they'll actually start getting bananas. It's really cool. So, a couple ways you can do that. And then, like, I think the easiest and probably the most common container plant is indoor herbs. Like, if you're wanting like really easy things to do inside, you have no outside space. You can't go wrong with indoor herbs. Other things, like growing tomatoes and eggplants and things indoors. Even if you have the lights and stuff, it can be a little tricky. But like herbs are just super easy to grow. I have a whole list of different herbs that do well, perennial herbs and annual herbs. So perennial ones you can plant once and they'll keep on coming back, like mint and lemon balm. Annual herbs you got to replant every year. I divided up the cool weather and warm weather, but really as long as your temperature is consistent, like somewhere between 60 and 80 degrees inside your house. You can do either one anytime you want. Just make sure, try give them, like a south facing window if possible. But what's great about herbs, most of these herbs are they don't need full sun. They can survive in partial sun, which is like 4 or 5 hours of sunlight. So if you just have an east or west, window, you should be able to survive, your herbs should survive. And even if you don't have any windows, or you have a north facing window, you can, get these light setups. You can get your own light setup, or you can. There's a lot of like you could buy the whole thing. Like these are really great. They're like self watering light setups for all your herbs, and it's just super easy. And you just put it in your kitchen and harvest it whenever you want. But if you do need some more additional light, remember aluminum foil, or mylar, things like that. Try to reflect that sunlight in the back, and that should increase your amount of sunlight. And then remember, like, definitely want to prune your herbs though, because you don't like if you put a single basil seed into this thing, it's just going to grow one stem and get super tall, and you're not going to get a whole lot. So after it gets a couple inches and gets a couple of sets of leaves, you want to start pinching them off at the top, pinch them off at each intersection, and then these little buds right here will suddenly start growing again, and then all of a sudden you have two branches, and then you pinch those off next week, and then you have four branches, and you pinch those, and all of a sudden you keep on doing that, every couple of days, and all of a sudden you have this bush, is awesome bush of basil where just going to get an enormous amount of basil from. And same with like woody stuff, you don't pinch them off, you would want to cut, try to cut them, as much as possible. The more you harvest, the woody stuff, the more it'll reproduce more. So like rosemary and things like that. Um, yeah, and then the one thing to think about if you're growing over the winter, make sure your window is either a nice window, it doesn't leak much, or if it's a window that does get cold, either keep the plants a little bit away from the window, or get that plastic wrap, that you can put on it to your windows to kind of conserve energy, and that will keep them, because if your window gets really cold, say it gets like 20 degrees outside, and then and it gets really cold near your plants, you could lose some of these herbs because all these herbs are won't survive the winter. So you want to keep them warm as possible. And then what really cool thing about a lot of these plants is a lot of these plants, these annual plants, are only annuals because there's a harsh winter that's going to kill them at the end of the year. A lot of them you can keep on growing, every year, and one of the best examples of that is your pepper plants. I have a lot of friends that have like 3, 4, 5-year-old pepper plants, and they just keep on growing them in a container. And when they'll bring them out in the summer, and then when it gets cold, they'll bring them back into a greenhouse, or in their basement, and keep them under lights and keep them growing. Um, and then and what's great, I mean, eventually you'll start losing quality, and we'll start looking sick after about 4 or 5 years. But you can grow these peppers for sure. It's like the most common one that you can grow for many years. I know some people have dabbled with eggplants and stuff like that. It's a little bit trickier, but yeah, if you make it work, let me know. But peppers is definitely the main annual I know that people do that with. And then you have all kinds of things like lemongrass that would die, but you can bring it inside, and then you can keep it, keep it growing every year. And so when you bring stuff inside, during the winter, you have two options. One is you can keep it growing all winter, and that's if you have lights. I mean, you're definitely not like this. There's just not a lot of sunlight in the winter, so it's hard to keep them growing in the winter in the window, and they might get a little sickly, because they're not getting enough sunlight. So you can get artificial lights, or move it to a greenhouse or something like that, and just keep them growing all year, and that's fine. You just need to make sure to water them and treat them, like a normal summer plant, that you're watering them every couple of days, and checking the soil and feeding them fertilizer and stuff like that. Or another option is just let them go dormant. So this is so like we do this with lemongrass. We have a lot of lemongrass, and I don't want to keep it alive all winter. So what I do is I just kind of I'll cut the lemongrass back to kind of like a little stump, leave a couple of inches on the top. So you want to prune whatever you have back, as much as possible. Keep it a nice compact plant. I'll let it dry out, and then I'll bring it into my basement where it's like cold and dark, and I just and it just kind of it goes dormant. Most dormant plant perennials. Over winter they just kind of they don't need water. They don't need to be fed, and they just kind of go dormant, and then. And when it starts warming up again, probably like April or May, you want to make sure to harden them back off. You don't want to just bring them straight out in the sunlight. Bring them out for a couple hours or for a couple days, and then and then water them really good, and then they come back to life, and they wake up, and then they start growing again. So that's one way. I mean, it's always a chance You could lose them, for sure, but most things that I've done dormant wise, it's definitely survived, and we do a lot of things dormant. So those are your two options if you do want to overwinter things. And then, all right, so next section, we're going to talk about some growing tips. And some of these things, like this, like growing indoors, is, I mean, this is kind of just a review of our propagation class. But, growing, I mean, that's what's great about containers. You can grow, indoors if you need to, if you don't have outdoor space. Look for, south facing window. If that's not enough sunlight, reflect that, use grow lights. Circulation's nice, having some kind of circular fan, or just like putting your plants near where you have where your exhaust or whatever your air filter systems are pushing out air. It's nice having some kind of circulation. Or if you can't give it all circulation all the time, maybe just like whenever you can, turn the fan on for like 5 minutes just to get kind of dry things out and kind of circulate the air a little bit. Um, and like, or you can open a window when it's nice out as well. You definitely want to think about watering, like sauce. You definitely get a saucer for things, or like I said, or bring it when you water, bring it to the sink, water it, and just let it, stop dripping before you bring it back. Avoid electrical things. You really want to make sure. Most people kill their plants by overwatering instead of underwatering, so definitely do the finger check. Make sure that never water a soil that's already wet. You want to wait till that dries out and then water it, but you don't want to let it dry out too long. But definitely try to wait till it's close to dry before you water again. Keep your temperatures 65 to 80 degrees, give or take. If it needs extra heat, if you have a radiator or old fridge, it's a great place to put some plants. And definitely think about like pests, like your pets. And then we're gonna talk a little bit more about fungus gnats. So if you ever have gnats coming out, like flies coming out of your potted plants, that's called fungus gnats. They're super easy to treat. We'll talk about different ways to treat, but if you want to prevent them, you can, putting like some a stone gravel on the top inch of your pot, and that will keep them, because they like to lay their eggs in soil. So as long as there's no exposed soil, like if you mulch or use some kind of gravel, then that's a great way to prevent them. But all this stuff should be review at this point. Light requirements, if you want full sun, you need 6 or 8 hours of sunlight. So if you're going for a window, that's a south facing window at the very least, or hopefully you can do south and then one east or west. But if you have herbs or things that can do partial shade, that's where you're looking for like 3 to 6 hours. So that's if you have an east or west facing window. If you have a north facing window, you're not getting any sunlight. So be careful on that. Yeah, you're not growing much. So you can do supplemental lights, or you can do, here's a list. It's not a full list, but it's a starting list of different things that grow really well in 3 to 6 hours. So greens, herbs, root vegetables, things like that. Strawberries are a fantastic container plant. Even on the indoors, they don't need a whole lot of room for roots, so they'll multiply. So you can keep on, dividing them and repotting them. And yeah, they're pretty easy to grow. Then adding indoor lights, and this is more review. If you want to do lights, look for the full spectrum. Or if you can't find full spectrum, use one cool and one warm and a double light fixture. And that way, because plants need different types of light at different times, or different spectrums at different times. So, or just find like an LED full spectrum as well. Fixtures, definitely a lot of different ways, from PVC to shelving. You just want to make sure you can move the lights up and down so the plant doesn't grow right into the light. And you want to keep the lights, at least like 4 to 6 inches from the plants, because the light chlorophyll diffuses over long distances. So and then like timers, so you're not, it's just too much to do on your own. So definitely get like it's like a couple dollar timer, stands, and all the kinds of equipment. But like I said, this is mostly a review from the propagation class. And then if you're doing like rooftop balconies, so let's step outside and talk about a couple of tips on growing outside. So a lot of people are, all they have is a balcony. So you definitely want to think about, because the higher up you go, the stronger the wind is. So if you're on the roof or you're on the balcony, you definitely want to figure out ways to chop up that wind. You know, having some kind of railing, you can even put like a light, shade cloth or something to kind of break up that wind a little bit. You want some wind to get through. You want circulation, so you don't want, but you also want to, you don't want your plants to get killed, especially over the last couple of days with the frost and the we had gale winds, which is like super hard winds. Like a lot of plants got tore up over the last couple of days. These wattle fences work really well. They break up the wind but allow some circulation to go through. Even sticking some bamboo wall, or putting big plants, big strong plants, perennials or stuff, around smaller plants. So definitely think about how can I chop up that wind so they're not just getting beat up, outside. And then definitely mulch as well. Mulch, if you want to reduce the amount you water, mulch is a great idea. Um, Definitely use like straw or shredded bark. I really like living mulches for containers. This is a clover, so they actually seeded a bunch of clover around this tree. I mean, you want the tree to establish itself first, and then you can seed clover, and that's actually a nitrogen fixer. So it's pulling nitrogen from the air and depositing it in the soil, so it's actually fertilizing this tree. As at the same time, it's like shading the soil. Avoid hay. Remember, hay's for horses, straws for people. Hay is like they chop down a wild field of grasses. It's got tons of seeds and things that's got high protein so you want to feed it to horses. Straw is like a farm grain like barley where they chop all the seeds off, and then there may be a little bit left, but it's mostly just stalk. So avoid dye mulches as well. It's got some toxic stuff. So and then like stone mulch is gravel mulch works really well if you have things like fungus gnats and things like that. All right. So again, like I said, some of this stuff is a lot of review. I'll just go through it real quickly. But if you have a tomato, plant it a little deep, and then that everything part of that tomato is suddenly going to become a root ball, and that works really great with containers because that means you're going to have a strong root system, so that tomato is not just going to fall over when the wind breaks, when the wind hits it. Definitely remember harden your plants off. Even if you're moving your containers from indoors to outdoors, make sure to harden them off. Spend a couple days, bring them out into the nice shaded, partially shaded, partially protected area for a couple hours, and then try to do it for longer periods of time, just so it kind of gets used to the outdoor elements, particularly the sun, so it kind of builds up the stronger out membrane, stronger skin on the plant, so they don't fry when you eventually take them out into full sun. And then let's talk about containers. So there's a lot of different containers out there to use, and some have are better than others for sure. So talk about sizes first, and then we'll talk about materials. So depending on what you're planting, is what kind of size container you're going to want. So we'll talk about like the diameter of the container. So this is like how wide that container is. If you got a really small container, things like herbs and strawberries and lettuces and stuff may work. But you need if you're going to do for most things, if you're doing an eggplant or pepper or romaine head or broccoli, you want at least a 12 inches diameter. So this is this is the measurements of a 5-gallon bucket. So it's almost 12 inches to the top and then 15 inches deep. This is like the perfect planting container for almost most things can grow really well in the 5-gallon bucket. Um, but if you want to do bigger things like summer squash or melons or things like that, artichoke is a really huge plant. You may need to find something even bigger than a 5-gallon container. But for most things that you're growing, like 5-gallon containers work really well. So if you just got a bunch of these containers, drilled holes in the bottom for drainage, that could be your whole garden. It's just from 5-gallon containers. And then depth size. So most of these plants need at least a foot, root space. But if you have a short container, again, look at these things, like strawberries and herbs, and things like that. So if you have a nice little cute little small pot, think about putting an herb or a strawberry in there. Like you definitely don't want to put a tomato or something like that. But And then the types of containers. So they all have like, bonus pluses and minuses to them. So um, terracotta is that, everyone's seen terracotta is that orange ceramic, container. They're cheap. They've been around for thousands of years because they're really great. Well, because they're actually porous, meaning they have small tiny holes all over them. If you can't, it's really hard to overwater a terracotta plant. So if you add too much water and it's not draining well, it will seep out the sides very slowly. Like you won't notice it, but it will, slowly, seep it out. So that's great because it can, it's hard to overwater. It's cheap. It cools it off the plant as well. It works well in the hot summer because it allows air to go in and out between the material. The downsides though is it's fragile, it's easy to break, and you got to be really careful with terracotta over the winter because if all those pores, if there's some moisture in the pores and it freezes, that's going to end up cracking and breaking your pot. So most people, if you have terracotta, it's a good idea to bring them inside during the winter if possible, or you may a lot of them may crack. um Someone's asking is oh yeah, those eggplant, yeah, this is the perfect kind of like small bush eggplant. That's I believe these are Asian eggplants. So they're like long and thin, and they're so much easier to grow than the giant Italian eggplants. And then glazed ceramic is basically terracotta with a glaze on it. So that so you completely lose the whole wicking part of this. But at the same time, it could survive the cold conditions a lot more. But it is easier to overwater. It doesn't have all the benefits of having that porosity like terracotta. And Yeah, yeah, it's definitely just as fragile. One nice thing, if I didn't mention with terracotta, a lot of people will use terracotta as a watering system, where they'll put a terracotta pot in the middle of their garden, bury it so the top is just level with the ground. They'll fill that up with water, and then all the water will slowly escape through the pores and slowly water your garden as well. So it's pretty cool. Um, in plastic, again, plastic's affordable, lightweight. The only problem is all plastic, all poly, material breaks down slowly in the sun. So having some kind of plastic container, is nice at first, but then after a couple of years, it's just going to, fall apart. It can heat up in the sun. A lot of times, if you ever notice, like, um, there'll be this phenomenon where it heats up on the sides, and then all the soil will push itself away from the sides because it gets so hot. And then when you water it, all the water rushes to to this gap now that's all around, because the soil doesn't want to touch the plastic because it's so hot, so it kind of pulls itself in. And then when you water it, all the water just goes down the sides, and then your plant doesn't get any of that water. So that really sucks, about downside with plastic. But you can, they make these inserts that you can put into these plastic, so that won't happen. It will actually be a barrier. So the outside layer will get hot, but then the inside inserts doesn't, so it doesn't do that shrinking thing. um wood's fantastic, durable, doesn't really heat up in the sun, but it's a little heavier and be a little bit more pricey depending on what kind of wood system you're doing. That's why a lot of people, um yeah, like having these like special barrels and stuff, it can be a little pricey. Concrete is fantastic, if you don't mind, yeah, mind moving a super heavy pot, but it stays cool. It's super durable, a super, yeah, but it's just super heavy. And then metal is really nice. It's cheaper, it's lightweight, but the problem with metal is it does get really hot. Like metal and plastic are definitely the ones that get the most hot in the sun, and metal is definitely the hotter one. Which does, I mean, it's not, you can still do metal, but you just need to water, like twice as much, because it's going to, your metal containers is going to heat up, and it's going to, definitely dry out your soil quicker. So you just need to stay on top of your watering if you're doing the metal. But metal, I mean, it makes really cool. I mean, you can get these big troughs, and you can get all kinds of really cool structures, and shapes with metal that you can't get with like plastic or terracotta. So that's great too. So if only, if you, if the shape that you want, it only comes in metal, go for it. Just know you're gonna have to water more with metal. And if you can pick, color, try to avoid black, because that absorbs the sunlight and that will heat up things, and it will dry out faster. So try to pick, lighter colors if possible. Um, but like I said, I mean, if you want, if you see a really cool black vase, you get it. You just know you're gonna have to water a little bit more. And then these are so this is like the next level, these root bags and smart pots. So these are basically, they take this landscape fabric and they sew it into a pot. And it's really nice. I mean, it's a little pricey, but you fill it up with soil, and the plant will grow. And then it does this thing called air pruning, where basically like the roots, will grow until it hits this fabric, and then we'll try to grow through the fabric, and all of a sudden realize there's no soil. So the tips of the roots will actually die off. Um, and that's actually, it sounds horrible, but it's actually is really healthy. It's really healthy for the plant. It's called root pruning, and what that does is the tips will die off, but then you'll get, it'll build more, a more thicker, healthier root system. When I used to be an arborist, and we used to get trees in containers, and then my last couple of years, they would send trees in these smart pouches, and the root systems were just like so much healthier and thicker. And they weren't, they wouldn't, like in the normal pot, like a root will get to the edge, and then it was no place to go, and it'll just grow around the circle, and then you have this like root bound block that can't even absorb water anymore. And that never happens with a smart pot. A smart pot will always stay like this, because instead of like growing in a circle, they just air prune the tips. So it's a really healthy way to grow some plants, especially perennial plants that are going to be in there for many, many years. Only problem is it's a little pricey, but if you want to save some money, you can actually make them yourself. You can buy some landscape fabric. You can, not the woven kind, the unwoven, so it actually looks like fabric. And you can just sew them in the sewing machine, or sew them with your hand, and just you can sew them, and get in some milk crates or whatever, and just plug in the fabric. And that's a real cheap way to have some smart pots. And then repurposing. So this is like the fun part about containers, because there's like a million ways you can repurpose things. As long as it has drainage, and you have decent soil, you can grow anything. We're going to talk about the plastics to avoid. There's definitely some plastics that are, that leach some nasty stuff, and then there's some plastics that don't. So you just definitely want to. We'll talk about that in a second. But I mean, I've seen people use, kid pools. These old recycling bins are great, for growing stuff. I love this, like that shoe holder, the wall shoe holder. Just fill up, yeah, as long as it has drainage, you can fill it up with soil. You can grow whatever out of it. Metal pots. Just make sure, like I use like a nail and a hammer to kind of pound some holes in the bottom. It's an easy way to get some drainage. Um, so repurpose containers. This is actually a coworker grew a sunflower out of a shoe, just to show, you can use like anything as a container. Um, but I love these like gutter systems as well. You can use all different kinds of things. Some of the things you want to avoid, though, that have some toxic stuff into it, and you can use that if you're using for ornamentals. That's fine. Like tires. Like, I see a lot of people do like artsy gardens with tires. I mean, as long as it's just flowers, it's not a big deal, but there are some toxic stuff in most tires. So you don't want to grow greens or something in a tire. um Plastics 3, 6, and 7, we'll talk about that. I have a whole slide on that, and a whole slide on pallets as well. There's good pallets and bad pallets to use. Anything that's not food grade, it's industrial grade, I would avoid industrial stuff. And then if you're using stuff that's like repurposed from like the 70s, you got to make sure, because a lot of paint in this, old paint, any paint from before 78 is probably is full of lead. So definitely, think about that as well. This question, I was afraid to ask for old gutters because of aluminum metal. Um, that's true. Yeah, is there something wrong with aluminum? I don't know a whole lot, but I've never really grown much in aluminum. I never grown in gutters, but is that something that can leach some nasty stuff? So yes, okay, so definitely, yeah. Want to check out some aluminum as well. That's good to know. I mean, I've never actually grown anything in aluminum, but I'll definitely do some research on that as well. So plastics. So here's the ones to avoid and not avoid. So all plastics degrade in sunlight, and all but some degrade somewhat harmlessly, and others degrade and leach out some nasty stuff. Like PVC and things like that. People still use PVC. PVC is that white tube that you can bend easily. They use it for hoops. As long as it's not in your garden, I guess it's okay. I mean, I would recommend not using it, but people still use it, and it's just when it's a combination of the sun breaking something down and then getting wet, and that water it will actually it will start deteriorating and leaching out things into that water, and that water will take it to uh yeah, that's what's going to be the transport. That's why if you have like an old hose, it may leach out some things, but you can prevent that by just keeping your hose in the shade or keeping it in the tool shed, or if it's in the sun, flush your hose out first on the grass. Turn the hose on for like 10 seconds in the grass before you water it, because whatever is leaching out, it's gonna that's fine. And then this is like the best hose. You don't need to throw away your hose and buy a new hose. But when you're ready to buy a new hose, look for a gator hide or some kind of polyethylene. Yeah, it doesn't really. It's a great material. But you're looking for like plastics that are safe in the sun. You want 1, 2, 4, and 5. So if you ever look on plastics, they have these little triangles, and they'll tell you the different types of plastics. There's 7 of them. 1, 2, 4, and 5. Like 1 is like soft drinks. 2 is like milk jugs and water bottles. 4 is like squeezable bottles and flexible containers. And 5 is like reusable microwave stuff, ware and things. So these typically are safe to use. And then like 3 is your PVC. It's just it can leach some nasty stuff. 6 is like styrofoam type products, and 7 is just like a miscellaneous, but most of the things in 7 you wouldn't want to use. So definitely, like, before you use a plastic container, look at, find that little triangle, and make sure it's 1, 2, 4, or 5. And then pallets. So I love reusing pallets to build fences, and like I love these, like, walls, like these garden walls and things. You just want to kind of just double check your pallet, because a lot of times they'll treat the pallet because for some kind of fungal issues, because they want pallets, and pallets is an industrial product. They want it to last a really long time, so they'll treat it in different ways to keep fungicides from breaking it down. And sometimes some of the treatments are really harmless, like the heat treated is great. It says HT on the pallet, that you're fine. The main thing you want to avoid is the MB. This is when they actually use like a pretty toxic fungicide that they treat the wood for, and that, so if you look at your pallets, most pallets will have this little stamp, and it'll say like country of origin, different other things I don't know about, but then they'll either say HT or MB, or usually HT or MB, but it might be like debarked, which is untreated, or European pallets or whatever. I've never seen anything but HT or MB. So you want to look on that, and as long as you can't find the letters MB on it, it should be pretty good to use. And then there's a lot of great like water smart containers. I love these, where you take like a 2 liter, and chop it in half and put it upside down, and then you have this little reservoir, and then you fill up with soil in that And there's a little. This is called soil actually wicks. As long as there's a little bit of soil touching water, it will actually pull the water up. And like roots are, I mean, it may be a little bit too wet in this area for roots, but then but it will pull the water up, and then the roots can get it out. So this is a really great way. You can, if you're going to leave for a week, and go water it really heavy, fill up that reservoir, and then come back. Different kinds of like angled, so you water it, and then the water kind of drains down, so you're being, conserving water. Or this is where you water the top, and then all the excess water goes down to the containers below. And then trellis options. So um, yeah, trellising can be a little bit tricky with containers, especially if you're not against a wall. Like the easiest way is just put the trellis right on the wall and then back the container, and that way, and that's a very sturdy system. But putting like a tomato cage or things like this, you can make it work, but just remember, like when that tomato fills up that whole tomato cage, and there's a gust of wind, that thing's going to fall over. Unless you have some kind of secure it to some way, is just something, or you are able to chop up, get some windbreak so it doesn't get the full gust of the wind. Or like I really like this system where they're actually building the trellis around the container, not even attaching it to the container. So or just like if you're doing beans or peas, just get some bamboo and you can make a little teepee out of it as well, and they'll grow right up that. So you can do trellises. It's just kind of difficult. So that's why people look for varieties that don't trellis, or that don't vine, that are more bush-like. I love this system. I saw this on, I can't remember where I saw this, but it's some Instagram site. But this is fantastic. Like you just fill up all these, like the 5 gallon barrel bucket is really the one of the best containers that you can use. It's a durable plastic. It doesn't leach bad stuff out, and it's just plenty of room to grow lots of things. So, uh, and then talk about drainage and soil. You definitely want to make sure you have enough drainage. So I would say at least 4 or 5 holes. Like some of these really fancy glazed and terracotta pots may only have one hole in them. If that's the case, I would drill a couple more just so you can have some decent drainage, because that's if you don't have decent drainage, you're going to have anaerobic situations that can get smelly. You're going to your roots can definitely die. So metal containers, using like a hammer and nail is a great way to punch your holes. Even like cloth, bags. Sometimes if the cloth drains well enough, you don't need to, but just if it's not draining well, put some holes in them. And then there's this myth that if you put like gravel on the bottom of your container, it's going to help drain it a lot. In reality, though, as long as you're using a decent potting soil, which we're going to talk about in a second, it actually, I mean, it doesn't work, and it doesn't help drain it anymore. I mean, it actually can prevent, what it does is decrease the root growth. So you're actually, decreasing the depth of your pot. But if you have a consistent, soil, it should drain pretty well. The only reason I may use gravel is maybe you have some holes that are too big and you don't want, your water, your soil leaching out or things like that. So maybe I'll put a little bit of gravel just to keep it from, the soil from falling through some big holes. But really, like it doesn't really add any more drainage. It actually just decreases your grow space. So instead of using gravel and tricks like that, I would just make sure you have a good potting soil, which we'll talk about. Definitely balcony. I've definitely talked to gardeners that have done the balcony, and they have pissed off the people below them, because they just every time they water, they don't think about the water falling off and going into the floor below. So you want to make sure, yeah, you shouldn't be spilling any water. You want to be able to like have the saucers for everything. This is nice. These plastic containers actually have little reservoirs on the bottom, so that way when you water it, the extra water gets captured in a reservoir, and then the soil wicks it back up. You can overwater it, and the water will come out to the sides. But you definitely want to take some time seeing how much you should water. Yeah, it's good to actually calculate, especially if you have a watering can. Be like, well, this container can take this amount of water before it starts leaking out, and you want to try to dial in your watering so you're not making the people below you very mad. And then the soil that you want to use. So you definitely don't want to dig up soil from your garden or your yard, because that stuff will compact, and yeah, it just won't you won't get the it'll just compact so much that you won't get the porosity in the air and things in there. So you want to use a light, fluffy, soilless media. Potting mix is really great. Potting mix works really well for pots. You can do a DIY where you can mix like a third compost, a third vermiculite, and then try to stay away from peat moss. I mean, if you have to use it, have to use it, but try to find coconut coir. And that's a great DIY. I mean, you can find all different kinds of DIY mixes, recipes online, but Definitely use some kind of potting mix that has, like like these little white styrofoam balls are perlite that's expanded, heated shell or volcanic rock, I think, and that's and it puffs it up, and then that's great to maintain drainage. So even if your soil compacts a little bit, it has these like puffy little balls that will allow water to pass through. So definitely want to, yeah, you want to use some kind of good potting mix if possible. In amending with organics. So this is a good idea. It's definitely, try to fertilize this stuff at least once a year. If you're doing, really fast growing, like tomatoes and stuff, maybe like once a month. But if you got like herbs or house plants or things like that, usually like once a year. Like you don't need to fertilize these things too much. The best thing is just mix in compost every time you plant, or add some top dress it if it's a perennial. Compost tea. It's nice to get some kind of beneficial biology going. So compost tea, or just mixing in some healthy compost. And then like, yeah, this is just the best Neptune's fish and seaweed fertilizer. It's got a little bit of everything, macronutrients and micronutrients, so you don't have to guess at what it needs. And then perlite, if you need to add drainage, buy some perlite. And that's going to really help with the drainage. But most potting mix, it has all this stuff already, so you don't have to worry about too much about most amending. And then, like I said, the biggest way you're going to kill your plants is overwatering. So definitely want to. And overwatering looks a lot like underwatering. Like underwatering definitely looks a little bit more saggier. And overwatering, one of the telltale things is you can, oftentimes the tips get brown. But I mean, even though you can try to tell the difference on this grass, a lot of times it looks exactly the same. And people are like, oh, and they're overwatering, but they think that the plant is underwatered, and they just keep on watering it until it dies. So definitely do the finger check. Make sure that soil is dry, an inch or two down before you add water. And then some simple maintenance tips. So if you're reusing pots, definitely want to sanitize your pots. A lot of times, especially if you've been using plants over a while and you've been adding fertilizers, you'll actually see the salts. The salts will start collecting on the outside of the pots from different kinds of amendments. So you definitely want to, anytime that you change plants, empty the soil. You take a brush, scrub that salts off, and then it's nice to even like clean it and sanitize it. You can either use a bleach water mixture, or you're opposed to bleach, there's all kinds of substitutes online that you can check out. Dr. Bronner stuff at the very least. Um, Fungus gnat. So this is what it kind of looks like, these little nasty guys. So it's a fly that comes in and deposit. They love exposed soil, so that's why using that gravel, will keep them from doing that. But not everyone's really into the gravel. So another way, so if you do get these, you'll also, it will look like fruit flies, just like flies flying everywhere. So a couple ways you can treat them. That yellow sticky paper works really great, but like 1 or 2 into your plant. That should like get all the flies within a day or two. And then, but the larva, if you want to get rid of the larva, mosquito dunks. These things are really great. Just buy them at Ace Hardware, throw one in a can of watering can, and then water it, and that's going to kill all your larvae in there. Some people use like peroxide mixtures and stuff like that. I don't. I would prefer. I like mosquito dunks as more like an organic biological control. And this works great for fungus gnats as well. Getting some like they love sweet stuff, so putting some like apple cider vinegar or something in there, and then with a cone they'll fly in. They can't figure out how to get out, and that's a great way to get a bunch of them as well. Definitely think, potting up, if you're doing perennials year after year, your perennials are going to get bigger and bigger. Like if you have rosemary in a pot, or aloe or something, after a couple years, they're going to outgrow that pot. I mean, they're just going to get bigger and bigger. So you got to think about, you got 2 options. Either you're going to need a bigger pot, so you're pot up, and add soil and do that every couple years, or you could divide them as well, kind of tear them apart every time they grow big enough for outgrow their pot, pull it out, divide it up into, chop it up into in several different pieces, repot them into like 5 or 6 pots, and that's going to buy you a couple more years as well. And then yeah, we just talked about like dividing. We talked a lot about dividing already, but Yeah, definitely. They're going to outgrow your container, so it's a great way to create lots of plants while keeping your one plant healthy and not overcrowded. And same with strawberries, as they send out these little runners, just chop the horizontal um, roots, and then you can pluck them out and put them into a new plot, and then they'll start their whole new strawberry patch. Pruning, you definitely want to. We talked about pruning, like the popping off the tops of your basil and things like that. But also, just if you're growing flowers as well, you want to prune them. A lot of times they'll get too big for the pot, so it's a good idea to kind of prune back. Um, Especially if they grow too much, you may start getting some fungus issues and stuff if you're not getting circulation. So feel free to like prune them to the shape that you want. And then also like deadhead, so if you have flowers, there's a thing called deadheading where after the flower is done, you cut off the spent flowers, and because it'll keep on sending energy to that flower. So you cut that off, and that's going to help stimulate more flowers. The only reason you wouldn't want to do that for certain things like rose hips. So roses, when they're done, if you let them sit there for a while, and like come back in like November, December, it actually turns into this like really delicious fruit that you can make. That's really high in antioxidants. And what we're going to talk about rose hips and other like cool edible stuff that people don't normally eat in the harvesting class. But if you're not doing rose hips, you definitely want to cut out your dead heads. Fallen leaves, especially if you move your plants indoors and outdoors or different settings, it's going to adjust by losing leaves. It just happens. It's usually it doesn't. It's not a sign necessarily that your plant is sick. Sometimes it's just adjusting to the new situation. So that don't freak out. I mean, if you end up losing a lot of leaves, maybe give it a little bit of fertilizer and or maybe give it more sunlight or something, or maybe less sunlight, depending on the situation. But if you get some leaf fall, that's pretty typical. And then if you're doing perennials or annuals and plots, definitely think about crop rotation. Don't plant a tomato in the same plot every year. Try to mix up your pots, so you're not depleting the nutrients as well. We went over a lot of this stuff: heavy feeders, light feeders, keeping in the same family if possible. If you're going to do like a whole brassica, container garden, keep all those in one spot, and then keep another spot, keep your nightshades like your tomatoes. So you can, it's easier to tackle pest issues when they're all in one spot. And then cover crop as well. I mean, this is most people probably aren't going to be cover cropping their soil, but it's a great way. When you think about it, it's hard to sometimes mix in compost and stuff. So if you want a cheap way to build a lot of organic matter in your soil, definitely think about over the winter cover cropping them, and then just mixing up that cover crop in the spring and letting it break down. So all right, so the last section of the class tonight. So we're going to talk about this basically different types of self-watering containers. So this is an example of that terracotta system I was talking about, where you can actually bury the container in the ground, fill it up with water, and then the water slowly leaches out of all the pores of the terracotta. You can also do that. I've seen like wine bottles. You fill that up and flip it upside down, and then that slowly leaches water out. Some people will bury plastic bottles and stuff. I mean, I don't know if you want to put plastic in your garden, but if you don't mind that, go ahead and bury bottles and puncture some holes in them, and then as you water it slowly, leaches out. So there's all different ways to kind of buy you some more time, so you're not watering every day. Maybe you can go on vacation and not have to worry about it. Um, so so we're going to talk about one DIY container. Um, but I like this container because it's got the whole system of this container is something that you can do this in most systems, but it does a really great job kind of explaining the self-watering system. So ideally, it's like two 5-gallon containers. One of them you drill a hole in the bottom and you attach with zip ties, like a yogurt cup or a smaller container, and then drill holes all over. Put that inside it's the second container. Have like this PVC pipe or some kind of pipe leading all the way down to the bottom. And the idea is you fill up the first container in that little cup with soil, and then you fill up, using the tube, you fill up the reservoir down here, and then this is like the wicking part of the soil. So roots aren't going to grow in here. This is going to be pretty wet soil, but it's going to, soil wicks, so it's going to wick it up here. So then that's where your plants can grab that extra water. So and I've actually done a couple of these at different gardens, and they work pretty well. So if you're looking for a container that you don't have to water that often, this is a really great system. So I have instructions on how to do, step by step, but I thought the easier way, these instructions for you all, if you want a step by step, but I'm just going to show you a video of how someone actually makes one of these.
Hey everybody, I still have a few more pepper plants that I need to transfer into these self-watering buckets. And since many people have asked how I created this one, so I just thought before I do that, I'll show you guys how to make one. So making this is very inexpensive if you already have all the tools you need. I'll just list what you need and hopefully you already have that. These are the items you will need. This is a hole saw, 3-inch, and then you also need a net cup that is also 3-inch to fit one of these. If you don't have a net cup, you can just use a regular solo cup. Any of those will work. You'll just have to cut holes at the bottoms and a few on the sides. But I like to use this because it's sturdy, and I have a bunch of these, and they're very, very inexpensive. You just go to any hydroponic store and you can find those. These are 3-inch. Then you need a marker. You will also need a drill bit. The drill bit will have to be the same size as the pipe that you're going to use. And this pipe is basically for feeding water from the top into the reservoir at the bottom. So drill bit, of course you drill, and then this PVC pipe. If you make a bunch of these, you can buy those long PVC pipe and cut them yourself, or you can buy ones that is already pre-cut. This is a 3/4 inch. Then you just need the 3/4 to fit that. And of course, you would also need 2 buckets. You can buy these at Home Depot, Lowe's, or any home improvement store. They're very cheap. I think they're like about under $3. The first thing you will have to do is place one bucket into the other. And if you raise the bucket up into really good lights, you can actually see where the inside bucket will end, and that whole part from there to here is going to be your reservoir. So the first thing you want to do is you want to flag that area. So you want to mark that, because this is where you're going to drill a hole for your overflow. So I just go ahead and mark it there. What you want to do next is take one of the bucket out. The one that you flag is going to be your outer bucket, so you want to put that aside. And the other one is going to be the inner bucket. This is where you want to drill your holes. So the first thing you would have to do is drill the center hole with this hole saw here. The little dot there will be your center, so that's going to be your point where you're going to drill. It doesn't have to be exactly in the center. You want to drill into the bucket first. Once you create a hole and it's sort of like stuck that way, you want to turn this to the reverse side, because if you turn it to the reverse, it gives you a smoother cut and it's easier. There you go. Now you have the center cut out. What that is for this net cup here to fit inside. So next, what you want to do is you want to drill another hole for this pipe to feed through. And this pipe is so that you can feed the water from the top into the reservoir without getting the soil all wet. I mean, you can feed it either way. I mean, if there's a lot of rain, the water would drip through anyway and drain out to the bottom. And then the overflow is when there's too much water, it will just overflow out so that it doesn't drown your plants. Next, we're going to drill this. To do that, you just pick a spot anywhere you want. So you'll pick a drill bit. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as it fits into here. Right, so the next thing you want to do is drill a ton of little holes around here. And the reason for that is if it has more roots, it can just come out of the hole into the reservoir. For that, we'll just use this drill bit. There's really no arc to this, so you just drill holes everywhere. So that's gonna take me a few minutes, so you guys don't need to see that. I'll just pause the video for now. All right, here we are. The holes are all drilled. It's not perfect, just drill anywhere you want. And now it's pretty much finished. So now, it would be like that. Then the pipe will go here. Then the net cup would be like that. And as you can see, the net cup extends to the bottom of the other bucket. And what this does is the reservoir is at the bottom. You put soil and you pack it into this area, and that act as a wicking mechanism to bring water up to the top where the roots of the plant will come down and get it. And then the final thing we'll have to do is we'll have to drill that overflow hole that we marked earlier. Let's do that right now. Here is the area where we marked it earlier, overflow. If you put this up to lights, you can sort of see how transparent it is, and you can see the inner bucket. And so you want to put the hole right beneath the inner bucket. It doesn't have to be exact because the net cup extend down to here. This much left is your reservoir, so you want to drill the hole right there. You just use a drill bit and then put one right there, just beneath the line. That's a hole. You're pretty much done. The next thing you do is transplant plant into here with soil. All right, I'm gonna show you how to transplant peppers into this self-watering bucket. Here I have 2 MOA Scotch bonnet. So I'm gonna remove one of them and put that in that bucket. The roots is pretty tangled, and this is how I take it apart. Just use a spray. First, what we'll do is we'll take this neck up here, this down, pack it down really well, and that goes there. And you fill the bucket up with soil, and let me show you what it looks like. All right, now the soil has been filled up to the top. What you want to do is dig a hole right there down the center, way down there, because when I transfer my plants, the roots are around this size. That way, it'll give the roots plenty of room to move down, and that's where the reservoir would be, where the water would be stored. That's how the plant would get its water. Now the plants has been transplanted in the bucket. So what you want to do is rinse it down with water to wash off all the dirt off the leaves, and just give it a good water so that it can water all the way through. Now, if you want to fill the bucket, this is what you do. So you fill this up all the way until it overflows to the side. See that? Once the water is full, it'll overflow to here, and that's how much left of the water you have in your reservoir. Now, this plant will be here, and it probably will not need water for maybe 2-3 weeks, sometimes even more if you have a lot of rain. In the summer, when there's a lot of heat, you probably want to watch this every week or every 2 weeks. And the last thing to do is label your pepper plants, and you are all done. I hope you find this video helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to let me know. And thank you for watching.
All right. And that's it for this class. Like I said, this is going to be a shorter class. Not a whole lot to talk about, but containers. But yeah, I'll definitely stick around if anyone's got any questions or anything. Feel free. But if not, I'll be sending some more info later this week about places to do volunteer your hours, about the rescheduling the April 30th class, and a couple other things. But yeah, thank you all so much. And like I said, I'll stick around for a little bit if anyone has any questions.
Great class, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, if no one's got anything, I'm going to go ahead and close the class. But thank you all so much and have a great night.